What if all the best tennis players in the world had the same technique? In other words, if there was an optimal way to strike the forehand, the backhand, or the serve, and then players could basically just copy each other and everybody would play the same. Well, this is obviously not the case because we see vast differences in techniques among the best players in the world. And through my extensive research, I was able to identify fundamentals that every high-level player has in common. However, when we look at the best players in the world, we can see they all strike the ball differently. It doesn't look the same. The only example I can think of where a player resembles another is Grigor Dimitrov and Roger Federer. They look very much alike. However, if you take a closer look, there are small differences even between Dimitrov and Federer. But other than that, I can't think of any other player that resembles another. And the reason why it's so rare to see players who look exactly the same is that players that make it onto the elite level are there for a reason, because these players were either taught or allowed to develop their own style. I can give you some examples of players who either went by their own feel. In other words, they did something by feel and it felt good to them and they just continued doing so, or players were mentored either by their coaches or by their parents and were allowed to keep their own individual style. And the first player I'm going to use as an example is the father of the modern forehand, which is Bjorn Borg. And if you remember, back in those days, nobody used the Western grips. In other words, players would have a continental grip and nobody really went over towards the Western side, whether it be the Eastern grip, the semi-Western, or the full Western grip. And Bjorn Borg was one of the first players. He wasn't the first one. There was actually some players before him. He used the Western grips, but he was actually taught to play the forehand with a continental grip, and he liked the way it felt going over towards the Western side. He used the Eastern forehand grip, and the coaches were actually telling him not to do that because this was considered wrong back in the day. But Borg didn't care and continued playing with an Eastern forehand grip. And it's not only the grip. Borg also was one of the first players to have a finish that went around his head, kind of like Rafa does. This was considered extremely wrong back in those days, but Borg liked the way this type of forehand felt and he continued doing so. And another controversial thing back in the day that Borg did was have a loop on his forehand, which now is a fundamental element of every high-level forehand. So prior to Borg, players didn't really loop the racket. They simply took it straight back, and when the racket goes straight back, the sequencing of the torso rotation is much different than with a loop. So Borg was the first player to play with a loop. He would take the racket up, then down, and when this happens on the forehand, the rotation is sequenced much differently. It is started much earlier, and therefore the contact is made much more further in front compared to a classic forehand. And Borg didn't really listen to anyone. He simply played tennis the way it felt best for him. And as it turns out, he became one of the greatest players of all time. And there are also examples of players who were mentored in a very good way. And Monica Seles was coached by her dad, Karol. And if you guys remember, Monica had a two-handed forehand. I don't even know how she was holding the racket. So she was lefty. I think she was holding the racket like this. Very unorthodox. And most coaches that got to work with Monica tried to change her forehand to a one-handed forehand because it's logical to think that she would have an advantage with a one-handed forehand. But her dad, Karol, knew Monica obviously better than anyone else, and he knew that for whatever the reason might be, her two-handed forehand was phenomenal. It was one of the best forehands in the world, and he didn't allow anyone to touch her forehand. And what happened was Monica ascended to #1 in the world faster than any other player in WTA history. And how about Tony Nadal? Most coaches would consider this type of finish controversial. And there is some logic to that because often players that have this type of finish are defensive. But Tony knew that Rafa's finish on his forehand contributed to a tremendous amount of topspin, maybe the greatest topspin forehand of all time. So Tony, instead of trying to force Rafa to do more of a conventional finish, he allowed him to have his own individual forehand that suited him and only him. Because that forehand that Rafa has came out completely on its own, and it matches his mentality, and it matches his body, and it matches overall his game strategy. It is not by accident that Rafa still to this day continues to hit his forehand like this. So what does this mean when we play tennis? Should we just go out there and do whatever we want? No, we have to learn the fundamentals. These are things that all high-level players have in common. There's no doubt about the fact that we must have these fundamentals if we have any chance to get better at tennis. However, there also needs to be some room for individuality, not only because it's going to be more fun for us fans to watch players with different styles, but also the players themselves would benefit tremendously from having their own style because it's going to be their style and no one else. And when players develop their own style, it is guaranteed to match their own body, it's guaranteed to match their mentality, and it's overall going to benefit their game more than if they try to force somebody else's style upon them. So what is the difference between style and fundamentals? Well, if I did this comparison on all the strokes, this video would be an hour long. So let's not do that. I'm only going to take the forehand as an example. So on the forehand, a fundamental part of the forehand will be your loop. So this is something that all high-level players have in common. So this part of the forehand is fundamental. In other words, the racket has to go up before it goes down. Now, how you get into this loop, this is going to be style. So some players get into it like this, other players get into it like this. There's going to be different ways to get into this position, and you should do it in a way that feels most comfortable to you, and this is going to be your own individual style. Another style element of the forehand is how the racket drops. So some players will drop it more with a straight arm and a closed racket face. Other players will be a little bit more open as they drop the racket. This is also going to depend on the individual. There's no right or wrong in this regard, and there's many differences among the pros and how this position of the racket is achieved. So what you should do is develop your own style. Maybe you're more comfortable closing the racket like this, or maybe you're more comfortable being more open as the racket drops into this position. Another fundamental part of the forehand, in other words, something that all high-level players do, is where they make contact. So you will not find a high-level forehand that makes contact with the dominant shoulder behind. This will happen only in rare circumstances. On the other hand, this often happens at the recreational level where the dominant shoulder is behind the non-dominant shoulder at contact. However, at the high level, all players will make contact with the dominant shoulder in front, and this has to do with the sequencing of the torso rotation. If you're interested in finding out exactly how this works, check out my video titled The Kinetic Chain. So another style element of the forehand is how we finish the stroke, and this is also going to depend on if you're more of a spin player, if you're more of a flat ball striker, you're going to have a different finish than other players. Some players will be a little bit more vertical as they come across, and maybe they're going to be more going up and then down around the waist. Other players will go more around the shoulder. So this is another stylistic element that has to match you. It does you no good to try to copy somebody else. You must do what suits your type of game and what feels the best. So guys, when it comes to fundamentals, you gotta have them. When it comes to style, develop your own. And the great thing about it is, when you develop your own style, it's going to be truly unique. And if it's really stylistic, other players will try to copy it.